Literacy is one of the things that through history significantly have improved women's independence. Hello. I'm so sorry for my voice today. I have such a terrible cold and I hope you can just bear with me with this one. Today we're going to talk about literacy, people's ability to read and write. And we could easily make this video about literacy for everyone, men and women alike, because that is interesting enough. The difficulties with doing that is that we actually then just tend to look at the statistics and we forget that there are differences. In most places and in most times in history, if there have been schools, people have only sent their boys to school. And that's kind of because of people thinking that the women wouldn't have any use for that knowledge. So it would just be a waste of time to give that education to them. But does the fact that the girls weren't sent to school, does that mean that they never learned how to read and write? Well, yes and no. As always, the question is a bit more complex than that. So we have to look at different times in history and different places. Let's go back to the ancient times. We have always thought that in ancient times almost everyone were illiterate, not literate. But that thought have been challenged in recent years. And now historians are discussing that probably, at least in ancient Rome, most people actually could read. And why do we think this? It has to do with the surroundings of the Roman life. Street signs, calendars, regulations on public buildings and everything like that, they have all been written in written language. If the Romans wouldn't be able to read it, there probably wouldn't be written language. It would be pictures and icons and things like that instead of writing. But since they are writing, historians now are debating whether more or less everyone actually could read. But that was the Romans, and the further we go into medieval times in Europe, well, we can say that hardly anyone could read in medieval times. Well, of course, quite a lot of people in the nobility could still read because whatever they did was so important, so they had to be able to read. The single most important happening for people's ability to read and write is Gutenberg in the 1400s inventing the printer. All of a sudden, books, pamphlets, newspapers could be distributed to more or less everyone. And with that, more people found it necessary to be able to read. But the first country to actually regulate anything about teaching its inhabitants to read was Sweden. Whoa, 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 whoa. Sweden, that at the time included what is today Finland, Estonia and Latvia. The church law of 1686 said that the church bell ringers had the responsibility for everyone's education and everyone's ability to read. The bell ringers didn't teach all the children, mostly the mothers did. And all of this is because of one book. Not this one, actually. You could easily believe that it should be the Bible, but the Bible was seen as too complex for the single-minded, regular people. No, not the Bible. That was for the clergy and for the nobility. But this book, this is Luther's Small Catechism. The first one was printed in the 1500s. This one is from 1768, I think. Yeah. There it says 1768. This book was created to simply explain the rules of the Protestant faith, and everyone was obligated to learn it by heart. Not just understand the meaning of it, but knowing it word for word. And there was a hearing of it once a year. And if you didn't pass that hearing, then, for instance, you were not allowed to get married, you couldn't take part in communion. There were a lot of things you were not allowed to do. In these hearings that was held by the priests in the parish, the priest also took note of how good readers his parishioners were. So we have quite a good record of early reading in Sweden, and Finland and Estonia and Latvia, of course. But the fact that most people could read this one did not automatically mean that everyone could write. And it didn't mean that they could read handwriting either. Probably most people would have had some difficulty in reading something else, a text they didn't already know, because this text they learned from their childhood, and then they just learned the signs for that text that they already knew, and then they just rehearsed that. So it would probably be quite difficult for them to read a text that's new for them. What about the other side of the Atlantic Ocean then? How common was it for the early immigrants of the Americas to be able to read and write? Well, we don't know really that much about it, but there have been some studies done, especially on the areas that once was New France, that is, parts of eastern US and eastern Canada. The research is done on the times between mid-1600s to the mid-1700s. The study have been on how many signed their marriage certificates with their actual names and how many signed it with just their mark. It seems like through this time, it's about 100 years, from the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s, the percentage of people signing their names instead of just a mark is just above 40%. And that doesn't change much. What changes is the part of this percentage that are women and what part that are men. In the early parts of this period, there are more men than women that signs with their names. But at the end of the period, around the 1750s, there actually are more women than men that signs their wedding certificate with their names. But we have to keep in mind that being able to sign your name does not automatically mean that you can write anything else. You know, that's what we do when we are children, isn't it? The first thing we learn to write is our names. Not until, well, the second part of the 1800s, most countries in the Western world had created some kind of state-funded school systems, more or less compulsory for everyone to attend. By then, most cultures had already changed so much that they already sent most of their children to school. But this made it compulsory, and also for girls. The role of the teacher in these new public schools, in most places, became the work of women. Of course, the headmasters couldn't be women. We couldn't have women deciding things. From what we can see, from the mothers teaching the children the catechism, to teachers in the early state school systems, the education of children mostly have been the business of women. Illiteracy is still a big problem, though, in some parts of the world. And a lot of organisations, including the UN, spends quite a lot of both time and money on educating children, especially girls. This hasn't been going on for that long, though. As late as in 1964, a man in Brazil was arrested and then exiled for teaching peasants how to read. And in Mexico, the underground system has icons instead of the written names on their train stations. They have been working with this really hard though, and they are getting better and better. So today the rate of illiteracy in Mexico is around 7%. But, as in many places, there are more illiterate women than men. The General Secretary of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, he said, "Every literate woman marks a victory over poverty." I will end this video today with a quotation from the magnificent Malala. You know, the girl that stood up for education and for that was shot in the head by a Taliban. Education is education. We should learn everything and then choose which path to follow. Education is neither Eastern or Western. It's human. I hope you learned something new today. See you soon, I hope. Bye.